Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay, a podcast focusing on meditation, the near-death experience, and all things spiritual. Hello, this is Jay Spillers with Inspire Me with Jay. My special guest is Stephen Martin. Stephen, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Jay. I'm looking forward to it.
So you've studied the afterlife extensively.
I grew up in a home that was pretty scientifically minded. My mother and father believed in the scientific method. They believed that, what's taught in school, even today, that the only thing that exists is material substance, matter, in other words. And that's what I thought. I went through college, and that's what my professors thought. But I had an out-of-body experience when I was about 25 years old. I was sick, and I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but just suffice to say that I popped out of my body, and I saw myself down in the bed with kind of sprawled out like roadkill. Didn't last very long, but it lasted long enough, and it was vivid enough for me to start to question the idea that material substance matter is all there is, because if that's true, then the brain creates consciousness. And if the brain creates consciousness, how could I be up here at the ceiling looking down at my body? And that started me going. And to answer your question specifically, what did I do? One of the first things I did was join the Rosicrucian Society, which is a society of, it's a society, it's a kind of club, an order, they call it, that studies metaphysics and metaphysical laws. And they have a whole course that you go through to learn about that. And so I started out as an adept. I went through several years of study and came out at the end as you start out as a novice and you end up as an adept. And I guess I'm an adept now. But that's not all that I did. I also read everything I could get my hands on about metaphysics. I wanted to find out, what reality is all about. And so I did. And then later on, when I was in my 30s, I had what would be referred to as a mystical experience, experience of mystery, where I was meditating. I was in my backyard. It was a beautiful late spring day, perfect weather. And I just I opened my eyes and I could see auras around the trees. I could see the grass and the flowers all were alive. And I sort of merged into what I call the cosmic mind, or the infinite mind, and had this fantastic experience where all I had to do was think about a subject and I had all the answers to it. I talk about that in one of my books in much more detail, but and I later on had a podcast like you. I don't do it anymore. I had it for about 3 years, and I interviewed quantum physicists. I interviewed people who were studying the paranormal, people who were studying afterlife and reincarnation. I interviewed the head of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. I interviewed him twice. He's written 2 or 3 books on reincarnation. And so probably I did over 100 interviews, and they were with people like that. And that really is where a lot of the information that I have, that most of them in written books or at least done papers that were peer reviewed, that sort of thing. So much material, it's unbelievable that it hasn't been reported on to any extent whatsoever in the mainstream media. But it's out there, and that's what I use in my books to back up my beliefs. And so there you go. Long answer to your short question.
Have you ever wondered whether the Bible was compatible with a near-death experience? In my book, Heaven's Truth, the parallels between the Bible and the near-death experience, your faith will be strengthened while you support this channel. In Heaven's Truth, You will learn about near-death experiences and other similar experiences in the Bible. Support for the Bible contained in NDEs. A central theme that runs through both the Bible and NDEs. How the NDE brings the Bible to life for these modern times. Evidence for both the Bible and the NDE, and much more. Great book. Spillers does an excellent job weaving the relationship between NDEs and the scriptures. 5 stars on Amazon, available on Amazon. Well, I think I've seen a few studies where it sounds like they're getting close. Scientists are to saying that we do survive death. They don't know necessarily whether it's forever or a few minutes, but they're getting kind of close to saying, yeah, we think we survive physical death. There's more than just the physical body to our reality.
Well, absolutely. But the thing of it is, scientific materialists still have the upper hand in the scientific community, even though quantum physicists have been saying for 100 years or more that there really is no such thing as matter in the way that they think of matter. I mean, there's if you get down, you got atoms and electrons and all that, and then you got quarks, and you go down even further, and it's strings, but strings aren't really strings; they're just vibrations. Everything is vibrations, and that's one of the first things you learn when you join the Rosicrucian Society, that there really is no such thing as matter. Everything is energy, everything is vibrations. And my theory is that the energy that is the ground of being of all that is what creates consciousness, and that matter, what we look out of with our 5 senses at the world around us and think is matter, is really created by consciousness. So, but anyway, yeah, there's plenty of scientific evidence, but the scientific materialists just don't want to let go, and they'll make up all kinds of reasons why this can't be possible, but they're grasping at straws at this point because there's so much evidence. There you are, Jay.
Well, and they had I don't know if you've ever heard of Mellon Thomas Benedict, who had a very profound near-death experience, said that eventually science would prove the existence of the soul.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think, yes. I think everything, we're going through a period of change right now. I believe very strongly in that. And that's one of the reasons we see all this chaos around us nowadays. But there's no doubt in my mind that eventually it'll become accepted as, self-evident that really consciousness is what it's all about, and that we all come from this ground of being that is consciousness, this what I call the source, or the infinite mind, or the cosmic mind. We all come from that. That's what we all have at our core. I believe we have, in religious circles, it would be called a soul. I think it's more, and that's fine, to call it that. But I think of it as more as a subconscious mind that's been built up over many incarnations, and that we have what I refer to as a higher self that really encapsulates all those past lives that we've had, that we're like, down here in this reality, we come here to experience and to learn, and we go through a stage of forgetting when we're born. Most people do. Some people have memories of their past lives, or even between lives. And certainly it's often brought out by psychotherapists who, hypnotize people and have them go back into previous lives to see what it is what their hang-ups are and where they originated. But so I see this higher self that we each have actually blends into the universal mind that's out there, the infinite mind, the cosmic mind. We're all expressions of that. But we do have our individual higher self, and So I do think we continue. Now, there are people who think that we go back into the infinite mind, the universal subconscious, I guess they would call it, and that we merge back into that when we eventually, after we die, and then we maybe come back out. But the fact of the matter is, there's really only one consciousness. So we all think we're separate, and we think we have our own individual consciousness, but really that consciousness that you have and I have is the same consciousness. It's the one consciousness. In some of my books, I talk about the law of one, and that's what the law of one is. We're all one. We think we're different because we have these memories of, growing up in a particular house, and we have a job, and we've developed an ego over the time we've been here. And the ego certainly wants to control us because its whole purpose is survival. But the ego is a false self. Our real self is the silent observer at the back of our mind, which is the same one you have at the back of your mind. So there you go, Jay. What do you think of that?
So is it sort of like God? If God was the ocean, we'd be like a drop of water from that ocean.
That is certainly the way it's often described. I think of it us, and that may be true. I'm not saying that is. I do think that if God could, I don't like the word God because it conjures up this guy with a beard up on the cloud, with a finger pointing down at us. It's really more my way of describing it's more like the Eastern religions have what's called the Tao, and the Tao is what is everywhere and in everything. It's more like pantheism, I guess. But I think of us, rather than being a drop of water that merges back into the ocean, I think of us more like little whirlpools in that ocean of consciousness that's swirling around, because we have our own minds and our own thoughts and our own higher selves. But we're definitely part of it. And we are, at the core, we're all come from that. And we do return to that between lives, but we do, I think, and I could be wrong, have our own individual awareness within that ocean. And when we're there, we realize that we're part of it, and all is one. But we still have our individual self, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I could be wrong.
So, like in terms of matter and energy, I've heard that matter is just energy that's sort of slowed down and kind of taken a more solid form. It's really the same substance. It's just slowed down and made hard, so to speak.
Well, it seems hard, I don't know about slowed down or speed up. I think it's all energy. It's all vibrations. There really is no such thing as substance. And if you could, look in with a powerful microscope, if you looked into a block of steel, you'd be able to see that there were great distances between all these electrons and protons and the nucleus and all that stuff. It's just vibrating stuff. That when we perceive it, it looks solid. And sure as heck, if you get hit on the head with a piece of steel, you're going to think it's pretty doggone solid. But it's, in the East, and the Eastern religion seems to me closer to what the truth is, which is that, that reality is a illusion. What we experience as reality here in this three-dimensional world we live in is an illusion, because we're really all one. There's no place. That's one of the things that quantum physicists tell us, is that there's really no place where one thing stops and another thing starts. It's all vibrations. And, the basic philosophical idea that comes out of quantum physics is that all is one, that everything is connected, that you've heard about the particles that that are entangled, I guess is the word they use, where even if the entangled particle was halfway across the universe, if the one over here changes, the one over there is going to change too. It's because it's all connected.
In terms of like
what do you think of that?
In terms of like the law of one, did that come from Atlantis? And how does it work into like other?
Well, the law of one, that term, the law of one, came from there was a back in the early 1980s. I think it began in 1982. There was a physicist who was studying reality and what is it really all about. I've forgotten his name, but he and another guy and this woman named Carla's name sticks in my head. Carla began channeling an entity which presented himself or itself as actually a civilization that had visited Egypt a couple of thousand years ago in Egypt, and had tried to taught the Egyptians a lot of things, like how to make the pyramids and so forth, but had also taught them about the true nature of reality, and they'd screwed it up and got it all mixed up. And so this entity decided to come back to Carla and her two friends, the physics professor and the other guy, whose name I can't remember. And they channeled him for several years. There are 5 books that make up the law of one, that are all the channeled information that came through Carla. And the basic bottom line of what the message is that all is one, what we've just been talking about for the last few minutes, that really there's nothing that's separate, and that we human beings are on an evolutionary path, and that this entity who called himself Ra, R-A, Ra, said that we would be moving into a slightly higher level of reality, the human race, that we would pass 51% in 2012. This was channeled back in the early 80s. And Ra described reality in this way. He said there's the first density is matter, just like the earth or the moon with no life on it. The second density is the earth, for example, with life, plants, animals. The third density is the earth with plants, animals, and sentient beings. That would be us. So we are in the third density now. But he said you're going to be moving into the fourth density, really beginning in about 2012. And that's when you pass 51% into it. And that fourth density will be when we realize, and it's widely known, everybody buys into the idea that really all is one, and what I've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or however long it's been becomes common knowledge. And when that happens, and for it to happen, we will each have to make a decision as to whether we're going to be, there are 2 paths that can be followed from after density, third density, and that is service to self or service to others. If you choose service to others, then you're going to use your abilities, your talents, your efforts to provide service to others. If it's service to self, you're going to be incarnating in another planet, because this planet is going to become a service to self planet, which would be a pretty good place to be. Service to self, folks, I think of, according to Ra, 95% of people on Earth would be service to self now. And the other 5% would be service to others. 95% would be service to others. I misspoke before. 5% would be service to self. And there are people like Putin and Hitler and a lot of politicians in Washington, as far as I'm concerned, who are really looking out for number one, and that's it. But they're not going to be part of this fourth density on Earth. They're going to be in a service to self fourth density in some other place, some other planet. That's what Ra says. Now, do I think all that's true? I don't know, but I do think that there's something to it, and that I do feel like we're moving in, and we said this earlier, is where people are beginning to accept that there's more to reality than what meets the eye, that there is something behind it all. There's some sort of an intelligence behind it all, whether you believe in God or whether you call it the Tao or whether you call it consciousness. There's something that creates it. And that's what is becoming known and accepted. So there you are, Jay. That's kind of what the law of one is about. All is one. And then, mystics have been saying that for thousands of years. It's not a new idea.
Well, it would seem that once you really start to grasp that we're all one, and not just intellectually, but really grasp it, it would revolutionize everything, because things like racial, ethnic, religious hatreds, they don't make any sense. All the divisions that we have in the world just are pointless.
Absolutely 100% true. One of the things that brings to mind, very much so, is if you know at all about near-death experiences, one of the things that most people who have those experiences report, and there are thousands of people who have reported this, when I'm not talking about a dozen, I'm talking about thousands of people. They feel they leave their body, they see their maybe the doctor is working on them, trying to revive them. They feel a tug, they look, they see a light, they pass through what seems like a tunnel into that light. They're greeted by, maybe their grandmother or somebody who's gone before, or maybe it's a guardian angel type thing. Depends on the person and the culture, but pretty much the same experience. And then before too long, they have a life review. And that life review, they describe as being their whole life, everything that they've ever done laid out before them. There's no time in this other realm, so that this makes this possible. And they see what each one of their actions and words and so forth, the effect that it had. And it's not just that they see what their actions and words, what it caused, they feel what the person that they were kind to and helped, how that person felt good and thankful for it. When they say a mean thing to somebody, they feel the hurt that person feels. When they injure someone physically, they experience that. I was giving a talk on one of my books at a church. It was a Unity church, that are kind of into all this sort of thing, Unity Church in Newport News, Virginia. And after I gave and I talked about this in the talk I gave about the past life review, a gentleman came up to me after the service and said that a good friend of his had a near-death experience and had this life review. And this friend of his, at one point in his life, had been in an automobile accident where a car ran a red light or a stop sign, I'm not sure, and crashed, T-boned his car. And his friend was so angry about that he got out of the car and he went over to the guy who hit him, pulled him out of the car and beat the crap out of him. Beat him so badly that the man was so injured that he was an invalid after that. He wasn't able to work and so forth. Well, when this guy had his life review, he experienced not only what that gentleman that he beat up felt, but also what the man's wife felt because she had to go to work to support the family, what his children felt because they couldn't go to college because they didn't have the money to do that. what all the relatives, what all the ramifications of him having done that. He experienced that in his life review. Well, if people knew that that's what's going to happen when they pass over, that they're going to have that, would they be angry with people? Would Putin be killing all those people in Ukraine? I mean, he's going to experience all that when he has his life review. Can you imagine that? But anyway, you're right. If once we have that life review because we really all are one. And so the idea when we hurt others, we're hurting ourselves is an absolute fact. It's not a metaphor. So yeah, once people get that through their heads, we're going to start being nice to each other. I'm not a religious guy, but I will say that Jesus knew what he was talking about when he said, follow the golden rule. Love your neighbor, love God, love your neighbor. That's his basic message. And he was absolutely right. I do believe that he was an advanced soul, a higher soul than the rest of us. And he came here to tell us what it's all about. Instead, we use his teachings, twist them around to exclude people from the church or whatever, which makes no sense. All you got to do is read the New Testament, read what he said. Nowhere in there did he say anything about homosexuals or people of different races or different creeds. He said, love your neighbor. And one of the things, the message of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans were hated by Jews. The priest who stood up and asked Jesus, what's the bottom line of the law? And Jesus says, love your neighbor. And the priest says, well, who's my neighbor? And that's when Jesus goes into the story of the Good Samaritan, who the priest and the Levite walk by the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan stops and helps the guy, bandages his wounds, takes him to an inn, pays for his care. That's Jesus' message. And he was right. And if we all paid attention to it and really did that, wouldn't it be a wonderful world? There you go, Jay.
Yeah, and it's like the life review is a judgment, but it's not directly from God. It's us judging ourselves. God may shine the spotlight, but it's us that's doing the judging. And that's what a lot of NDEs say is, I didn't feel like I was judged from God. I felt like I was judging myself in that process.
That's exactly what they say. And often, apparently, there's a, depends on, again, the culture, but a angel or some sort of spiritual being there who really helps the person who's going through the life review, comforts them, and rather than judges them, whereas they're judging themselves. And you can imagine, I'm not looking forward to parts of mine. I know that, when I was younger, I did some things that I'm sorry for now. And I'm going to see all that and, but we're all human. We all make mistakes. It's never too late to change and, start on a new path. And that's what I've tried to do since I've learned all this and figured it out. I'm accepting of everybody, even people who don't like me. That's fine. If they don't like me, I don't care. But I'm not going to do anything to them. That's their business.
Do you think
that's what I think.
What do you think? Like if a person comes to understand in this lifetime wrongs that they've done and repented, that it'll sort of soften the blow in the life review because we've sort of learned our lessons?
I certainly hope so. Jay, I hope so. I think so. I've tried myself to think back to things that I wish I hadn't done now. And, I think that I've thought about, what must have been the ramifications of what I did, how the person must have felt. And I'm hoping that that's going to make it easier to go through it, or maybe I don't think it's going to get rid of it completely, but I think it'll make it easier to go through because I'm going to be expecting it. And, one of the things that people say, haven't really done this, but is to try to make amends. If there's somebody, being angry at someone, being bitter, who does that hurt? It only hurts yourself anyway. It's what somebody said was something like, being bitter against somebody is like taking poison and thinking the other person's going to die. It doesn't happen that way. There may be somebody who really hates your guts. That doesn't hurt you. It hurts them because they're the ones that get eaten up inside with all that trauma and bitterness. So there you are. That's what I think. I'm hoping that it does soften the blow.
What do you think is the best evidence for life after death?
Well, there's a lot of it. I mean, the near-death experiences are part of it, part of the evidence, I think. But as you said, doesn't mean that you go on forever after you've died. You know that it's going to be for a while at least. But there have been other studies. For example, one researcher that I interviewed twice when I had my podcast, her name is Julie Bichel. And Julie Bichel has a PhD in pharmacology. And she, pharmacologists, one of the things they do is they study drugs and the efficacy of drugs. And so they have to have a placebo and they have the real drug. And they have all kinds of blind testing so that it's done in a scientific way so that they know whether the drug works or not. Well, what she has done is take that same methodology of blind testing and used it on psychics who say that they can communicate with the dead. The reason she got into this is that her mother committed suicide and she was not brought up in a religious home, had no idea about, she was only in her 20s at the time, had gotten her PhD, but wondered whether her mother still existed somewhere, whether her consciousness was still there. So she started studying this, and she has since founded an organization called the Windbridge Institute. And I think her website is windbridge.org. But anyway, she has conducted all these studies with psychics and found that indeed some of them can, whether it's communicate with the dead or communicate with the Akashic records or whatever it is, but they're able to deliver information that no one would have known other than the so-called deceased person that they're communicating with. And the statistically significant results, and she has published papers on this, peer-reviewed papers that have been accepted and published based on her methodology. So that's one thing. Another would be reincarnation. The University of Virginia School of Medicine, and I mentioned it before, the Division of Perceptual Studies, has been studying children's memories of past lives since 1967. They actually began studying this even before. I think it was in 1962. A gentleman named Ian Stevenson. He was a psychologist. He was head of the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia Medical School, and he was interested in reincarnation. He had, I guess, had children who had memories, and so he started investigating this. And he put out a book in 1966 called, he called it 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, where he had questioned the children and the parents and so forth, and actually found an individual that fit the description that the child gave, you the name and the name of the wife and the job that he had and how he was died and so forth. They now have at the University of Virginia, this department, this division, they call it, over 2,600 cases that they've studied. And the last time I talked to the director of that division of perceptual studies, he had told me at that time that over, I think it was something like 1,700 and some had been what they call solved. In other words, they had the information that the child related about his past life and had found someone who fit that description and the name and the occupation, all of that, the place, the town. In fact, many of the children had birthmarks that corresponded to the way that the child or the previous incarnation had died. Because most of these children, when the lives they remember were cut short, I think that's one of the reasons they remember it. They were either murdered, they were killed in an accident, they were killed in war. Some reason, some way or other, their life was cut short. And the average time between the past life and the current birth of the current individual entity is 15 months. So, for example, there was one guy who apparently was riding his bike. He was a school teacher and was shot in the forehead. And the bullet went through his head, and there was an exit wound in the back, splatter kind of exit wound in the back. Well, there are pictures of the corpse where they showed the bullet went in the front, bullet hole, and splatter in the back. This child was born with a mark on his forehead and a birthmark in the back, splatter. There's one person who was run over by a train, and the train cut off the person's leg. That child was born with his leg missing below his knee. There's another one. I mean, they're all there. There's a book that actually Ian Stevenson wrote that recounts over 200 of these children who were born with birthmarks that correspond to the wound that killed them in the previous life. So if reincarnation is a fact, and I think the people at the University of Virginia would say it looks like it is with our 2,000, or so cases, then there has to be an afterlife, because there's got to be a time between when that person was killed or died and when they came back by being born.
So, yeah, I mean, like with the near-death experience, we see some pretty strong evidence where like people are able to describe vividly what's going on in the room, even though they're totally unconscious in terms of their body, or what's going on in other rooms, what people were wearing, and it was later confirmed. But then there is some evidence, like with NDEs, where they encounter other people that they couldn't have known anything about, like a grandparent that died before they were born, but they were able to describe what they looked like and what they said, and then it was confirmed later by a family member. Or like a little boy who was like 3 years old, he described meeting his sister who had died in a miscarriage, and his parents had never told him that they had had a miscarriage. And evidences like that would seem
one of the most amazing. Yeah, one of the most amazing stories like that that I'm aware of was told by a professor at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, a psychiatrist also, who was studying these children's memories of past lives. And the story he tells is there was a boy, I think he was 8 or 9 years old, who had meningitis. And his parents were at his bedside, like for 36 hours, and he had a near-death experience. And when he came back and was revived and was able to talk, he told his mother and father that his sister, who was away at college in a different state, that he had met his sister over there on the other side, and that his sister had told him that she had to stay, but he had to go back. Well, this, got the parents all in a flutter, and the husband, the father, went home to call and tried to call the daughter. And when he did, he got the authorities at the university where she was, who said they'd been trying to reach him, that his daughter had been killed in an automobile accident that corresponded, with the time that the child, the brother, the 9-year-old brother, had seen his sister over there. So that really is an amazing one. So there you are, Jay.
So you think like the NDE, reincarnation, are good evidences for the afterlife? Are there other ones besides those?
Well, one of the other things that the University of Virginia study in the same outfit has to do with, and it's really to show that the brain does not create consciousness, that the brain is a receiver of consciousness, and so therefore your consciousness really isn't created by your brain. It's picked up by your brain. I mean, you're tuned into your own brain. That's why some people, I think, get messages. I wonder about people who are schizophrenics. Hear voices. There are other voices coming through, but and that is that it's apparently common for people who have Alzheimer's or dementia, or who go into a coma for some period of time before they pass, that right before they die, they become lucid, and they're able to have a lucid conversation with the people around them. And then, after a few minutes, or usually just a few minutes, they pass away. This was true of my own grandmother, who had dementia badly. I guess they would have called it Alzheimer's back then. No, not then. They didn't even know what Alzheimer's was. This was 30 years ago, or more. But and the theory there is that when the brain dies and it lets go of the consciousness, that's when the person becomes lucid for a little while, and then they pass. So that's more evidence. And then there's something else. What is it? Oh, well, this again shows that the brain doesn't create consciousness. There are people who have hydrocephalus, I think it's called. It's where they have fluid on the brain, and something as much as 95% of their brain can be incapacitated, and yet they're abnormal and sometimes even above average intelligence. So that it shows that the brain doesn't really create consciousness. So if the brain doesn't create consciousness, and consciousness, your consciousness, my consciousness, exists somewhere else, then certainly when the body dies and the brain dies, it's going to continue to exist. I mean, it's energy. Everything is energy. And one of the laws of physics is energy can't be created or destroyed. It only changes form. And I believe that's what happens with our consciousness. Our consciousness continues, and we go to a place in another realm where we have probably been many times before. It's like going home, they say. People who have these near-death experiences say it was like I was coming home. It was very familiar, and I saw people that I knew. And I think we do probably have a soul group that we're part of, and that we come into this realm to experience and to evolve and to develop. And that's what life is all about. If you look around, one of my books it's a novel called The Secret of Life. And the secret of life, I'll spill the beans, is the urge to become. That's what is happening all around us. If you look out at the trees and the plants and little children, and all of us, we're all becoming. We're constantly growing and changing and evolving. That the Rosicrucian society, the image for the society, the logo is a rose, and it's a rose that's unfolding. And that's the idea of what life is about. It's an unfolding. And I really believe that. The secret of life is the urge to become. And as long as we are becoming and growing and evolving, we're living life. Once we give up, people who work all their lives and then they retire and they sit around and then they die 2 weeks later. It's because they're no longer becoming. That's my theory anyway.
So do you think they talk about studies that are saying people are becoming less religious, less people believe in God? Is it sort of like when the science comes around and people start to see all these things, will there sort of be like a full circle where you'll go from people one time where we were very religious to secular materialists back into more of a spiritual, but it'll be more informed in terms of most people's understanding?
That's what I think is going to happen. I saw results of a study recently where only 80% of people interviewed say they believe in God, whereas it's dropped from something like 92%, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. I also think, if someone asked me, do you believe in God? I would say, I believe in an infinite mind. The word God is, doesn't conjure up the image that I have of what that is. So yeah, if the infinite mind is God, yeah, there's God. And I think that more and more people are maybe becoming spiritual, but not religious. I think that our religions tend to become, taken over by our patriarchal society that wants to control things. And that's not what Jesus had in mind. I don't know what Mohammed had in mind, but certainly, Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Christian. So I think that maybe either the religions will transform somewhat and adopt this new science, because that's what it is, or something totally different will evolve. But yes, I think we're going to, I would say in 50 years at least, what we're talking about tonight will be common knowledge. It'll be taught in schools, just as materialism is taught in science classes today. And once it is, the world's going to be a better place. It's got to be.
Well,
that's what I think.
Yeah. And you talk about UFOs and aliens. Are they basically at that stage where they know the spiritual realities and they're operating on fourth density, law of one? They've totally got that. Is that where most UFO and aliens are?
I think so. There may be some bad guys out there too. There are the service to self folks, but I think that's a very small percentage. I think that most UFOs are from another dimension. They're already at fourth density or higher. According to Ra, it goes all the way up to seventh density. Fourth density is the last material density. Ra said that Jesus was a fourth density being who incarnated here. And there are probably others as well, other spiritual leaders, a lot of Hindu type guys, gurus. But I think that what UFOs are they're from a non-physical dimension. They zip into our dimensions, check us out, and then they zip out. And that's how they can do all those crazy maneuvers that if there was a solid spaceship would not be possible, because it isn't. It's a orb or whatever. When I was my first job out of college, let me just tell this story quickly. I was working at an ad agency in Baltimore, and my boss had retired from the Air Force. He was a colonel, I think, and had been a pilot. And he and I were having drinks after work one day, and he told me that once he was flying this transport plane across the Atlantic, and it was one of those big transport planes, and I think it had a crew of 7 or 8 people. And this orb, came up next to the plane, flew alongside the cockpit. Now the plane's going, however fast those planes go, 300-400 miles an hour, but that orb is just tracking right along, and it tracked along for about half an hour, he said. All the crew saw it, and then it just went and shot off to the right and was gone. He filled out a report, filed the report. Everybody in the plane who'd seen it attested to it, and that was the last he ever heard of it. Well, to me, that orb was something from another dimension that was checking this plane out, and after, I guess, he figured it out, and then he left. And I think that's what most of those UFOs are. Now, there are people who get, abducted by the Greys, and poked with things and stuff like that. I don't know about that, but there may be some bad guys out there too. But I think most of them really respect the idea that we have free will, and they're not going to come down and say, take me to your leader, and, this is what it's all about, because we got to figure it out for ourselves. And I think we are. And I think we eventually will, as we've been saying all evening, that we'll be able to have it taught in schools one of these days. As soon as science realizes that they've put themselves in this materialistic box where they can't figure out where consciousness comes from, that's called the hard problem. Consciousness is the hard problem for materialists because they haven't any way to explain how it happens or where it comes from. They think it comes from the brain, but they're wrong. Once they realize that it's matter that comes from consciousness, not consciousness that comes from matter, then they'll be able to figure out all kinds of stuff that will be very helpful. They'll figure out how the Egyptians were able to build those pyramids with those 70-ton blocks that are so, put in place. Apparently they did it. It was sound or something that they use that levitates things. There's stuff like that could be discovered once they get out of that box. As I've said, they're in about matter being all there is, which is ridiculous. One of the big evidence for me, there's a lot of evidence, but the one that really clinches it for me is the DNA molecule. In our cells, every one of the billion cells in our body has a DNA molecule in it that's that double helix thing that if you stretched it out, it would be over 6 feet long. And if you look at it under a microscope, you can see that it's like computer code. I'm sure you've seen printouts of DNA, and that it's 6.5 feet long. And, how did that come about by accident? Because it would have to have come about by accident if the materialists are right, that all that exists is matter. Because intelligence and consciousness and computer code could not have come about until evolution produced a brain. And, for evolution to have produced a brain, you have to start with DNA. And DNA is 6.5 feet of computer code that is so small that it's microscopic. You have to look at it under a microscope. There's no way, a mathematician will tell you that there's no way that could happen by accident. So it had to be intelligence behind it of some kind. Well, and if you say it was the guys from the other dimensions, well, where did they come from? There has to have been a beginning somewhere.
Well, is there a similarity between fourth density and like what religion would call resurrection? Like when Jesus resurrected, he had some physicality where you could touch him, but then he could materialize and dematerialize and walk through walls and things like that. Is that kind of like in a resurrection, you're sort of fourth density at that point?
Well, I think that, yeah, I think there is a body. I mean, it's not necessarily fourth density. What we're talking about here is moving into the non-physical realm. I think we have what is it called? An etherical body. I mean, the body is like layered, and we've got what we think of as flesh and muscle and all that, but under that is a spiritual kind of body. You know, how Jesus did it, holding the molecules together. But there apparently are other times when people appear to a loved one, for example. I have an aunt who had somebody come and visit her, at the base of her bed. So, I mean, apparently that does happen on occasion. Whether Jesus materialized or whether, I don't know. I do think that, as I said, he was a fourth density being, and he knew what he was talking about. And if people just look at his words and not how they've been interpreted, but necessarily by others, they would know what they ought to do with their lives. He, yeah. Well, anyway, I don't know the answer how he did that, but I do think it is possible for someone to appear, because not just Jesus who's done that. There are other reports of that happening.
Do you know any specifics?
What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I think it sounds very similar. And sometimes you hear people talk about like the fifth dimension. Is that the same thing? Saying we're going into the fifth dimension, is that the same thing as saying fourth density? Because it sounds pretty much the same.
Well, the different densities, we talked about the first density is matter, the second density is life, third density is sentient life, the fourth density is understanding what it's about. The fifth density is where apparently you gain more knowledge. And if there's a sixth and a seventh, Ra, the one who was channeled by Carla that we talked about earlier, the law of one, said that they were from the sixth density. And he explained all that, but I've kind of forgotten what it's about. But the seventh density is the last one before we return to the source, and then it starts all over again, I guess. I don't know. I'm really not that interested. I'm still hanging around here in the third density and hoping we'll get to the fourth, and I'll be happy, because it's going to take, to get through all seven. Who knows? A billion years? Who knows? It's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. We'll be in the fourth density for at least as long as we've been in the third, and it's been a long time. I mean, humans have been around for certainly a couple 100,000 years. Yeah.
Well, so is there a similarity between high-level aliens and angels? Like people talk about like the Octurians, and the Octurians, when you hear how loving and compassionate they are and things like that, they sound very much like angels. There may be a difference, but they seem very similar.
I think angels, it may be. One of the things apparently that happens as you go up through these different densities is that the one thing starts to combine. I mean, for example, Ra said that he, she, it, they was really a civilization. And I guess each member of that civilization has its own consciousness, but somehow combined, and all the knowledge of that civilization and all the memories of that civilization are available to everyone. because they have become like one, really one, indeed. And Ra is no longer incarnate, so he could be a being that you might come in contact over on the other side. That would certainly make sense, and we would certainly interpret Ra as being an angel. Apparently, he did incarnate in Egypt, and there's even pictures of him. I've got a book that talks about fourth density, and I've got the picture of Ra, the Egyptian god Ra, on the cover. So I don't know whether the Egyptians, made up what Ra looked like, but they certainly had a god that they put in their hieroglyphics they called Ra. So, yeah, there you are.
Well, is it possible that some worlds, maybe even our own, are actually being directly created by fifth or sixth density as opposed to the source directly?
That's a possibility, I suppose. There are some people who think that we live in a simulation, a computer simulation. I don't think so, because if that were true, it would be the computer that's creating consciousness, and I don't think matter can create consciousness. I think consciousness creates matter. But I suppose it's, if you get into all these ancient religions and the idea that there were once titans, giants, that's certainly part of mythology, then perhaps these higher level beings have come to Earth at different times, like Ra says he did with the Egyptians, and have kind of stirred the pot, maybe even done a little genetic engineering, I suppose, to make humans who they are. We're really not, we're, as far as DNA goes, pretty closely related to apes, but we're very far from apes as far as being sentient beings. And nobody really has found the link between Homo sapiens sapien and the other primates, even now. There are other humanoids out there, the Neanderthal, but we didn't evolve from Neanderthals. We lived at the same time as Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals died out. Either we killed them off or they somehow destroyed themselves. And there are other humanoids, that have been found, Homo erectus, but we didn't evolve from Homo erectus either. We were living at the same time as Homo erectus. It used to be that people thought that was the evolution. We got to be Neanderthals, and then we evolved into Homo sapiens or whatever came after. But that's not the way it was. There were probably at least a dozen different humanoid type creatures out there at the same time. Now they've realized that, because Homo sapien types go back at least 200,000 years. Bones have been found. It remains. Going back that far.
Yeah, I thought that Edgar Casey had talked about how basically evolutionary processes happen, but that Jesus had sort of genetically enhanced human beings, sort of perfected and improved them at some point, and then you got Adam. Had you heard anything about like Edgar Casey and his teachings on this enhancement?
Yeah, I know. Edgar Casey, I'm very familiar with. In fact, I actually interviewed Edgar Casey's son, Edgar Evans Casey, before he died. He was 95 years old when I interviewed him. So he was very lucid, pretty sharp guy. I guess he died a couple of years after that. That was back in 2007. I also interviewed Kevin Tedeschi, who's still the CEO of the Association of Research and Enlightenment at Virginia Beach, which is the institute that Casey started back in the 1930s. From what I know about Casey certainly believed that, or said from his contact with the Akashic records, that there are ancient civilizations that were destroyed, like Atlantis, and Muir, I think, is one. And when you look at the geological record, probably what happened was there were these civilizations that existed that were pretty far advanced. And when the Ice Age came along, they continued. But then the Ice Age ended fairly quickly. Apparently, the Earth slipped on its axes, and the ice caps melt. And that's where these myths of the flood, the one in the Bible, but there are other civilizations that have the same myth, where the floods destroyed the civilization. And that makes sense because the water level would have been something like 300 meters lower back during the Ice Age than it is now. So, and since most people, even today, live near the coast, in China, 80% of the people live on the East Coast. In the United States, just think of all the people that live on the East Coast and the West Coast, and the middle is less populated. Well, the ancient civilizations lived on a coast, and when that ice melted, it caused a flood, and it wiped them out, and the water level rose, and they were submerged, and those civilizations were gone. So that's one of the things that Casey talks about. Now, I'm not sure if it was Casey or Jesus himself who said he was the Alpha and the Omega, which means he was the Z, Alpha is A. So Alpha and the Omega. The Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, and Alpha is the beginning. So he was saying that he was Adam, and he was the end of, I guess, human evolution. So maybe so, because the fourth density is apparently the last physical density that we'll experience. When we get into fifth, we'll no longer incarnate, we'll no longer come into a physical dimension, according to Ra. So Alpha and the Omega, Adam and the last human.
So do you think like Jesus was that directly sent by the source or God? And how does that work, you think?
I think that Jesus was probably spent some time in India, but there's between the time he was 12 years old and was preaching in the synagogue, and when he was 33 or 31 or whatever, well, I guess he died when he was 33. When he was 30 and was baptized by John the Baptist, between 12 and 30, there's no record of where Jesus was, at least in the Bible. But there have been studies done and books written about the idea that Jesus went to India and lived in an ashram and was taught by, Hindu gurus. And what Jesus realized, and what I think, and either he had a mystical experience like the one I had, but I think it stuck. And he realized that he was an incarnation of the source, of the infinite mind, and he was in contact with that. And if you look at what he said and the words that he said, I and the Father are one. It's not me who does the work, it's the Father who does the work. His word for Father was, if you replace that with source, he knew that he was the source incarnate. And that's why the Christian church, and we're all the source incarnate. The problem is we don't know it. So, but Jesus did. And that's why he said, love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. That's the law. And that's what all the 10 commandments are about, and the 140 or so, or 640, however many of the Jews had on top of the 10 big ones. And so, I mean, there are other things that Jesus said that will lead me to believe that. For example, there was one point where the Jews were going to stone him, and they said, "Well, why are you going to stone me?" And he said, "Because you, a man, claim to be God." And Jesus said to them, "Well, does not your law say ye are gods?" And he was quoting one of the Proverbs. I think it was Proverbs, where that is what it says: "You are gods." We all are. We're all children of God. We all come from the source. So he said that. It's not just me. You are too. You just don't know it. You think you're separate. You think you're all, I'm over here and you're over there. But that's not the way it is. We're all one. So I think Jesus knew that, and that's what he was trying to tell people. But, then men got a hold of it, and they got a pope, and they built a whole hierarchy, and they kept women out of it, and so we've got what we've got. I think there are some churches that are really very, like the Unity Church I talked about earlier. They know what's going on, and there are some others that do. But as long as they're sticking to all this doctrine that they've built up over the years, reincarnation. Jesus talked about reincarnation. One of the things he said to his followers was, "Who do people say I am?" And his followers said, "Well, some people think you're John the Baptist, and others think you're Elijah or one of the prophets." Well, Elijah died 400 years, and so did the other prophets, at least 400 years before Jesus lived. So how could he be Elijah or one of the prophets if he wasn't reincarnated? So it was common knowledge then, but it was Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, put the pressure on the Pope at the Second Council of Constantine in 553 and had him expunge reincarnation from Christian doctrine. And that's the way it's been since. But for the first 500 years, it was part of the church.
And I've heard
there you go.
Yeah, I've heard that there are Orthodox Jews today that still believe in reincarnation.
Well, the Jews certainly did. Some of the Jews, I think the Sadducees, one sect believed in reincarnation and the other one didn't, or resurrection of the body, they called it, but it's the same thing. I mean, the fellow I talked about, Kevin Tedeschi, who's the head of the Association for Research Enlightenment, says that he has counted 11 different references to reincarnation in the Matthew Gospel alone. They don't use the word reincarnation, but that's what it's referring to. I mean, that's what they're talking about. So, yeah, I think everybody back in 2000, just about everyone back 2,000 years ago, took reincarnation for granted, just as they do in India and Thailand and other places today.
So, yeah, well, thanks for coming on the show today. What are some of the projects and books that you're working on or have worked on that you would like to share with the audience?
Yeah. Well, what I would ask the audience to do would be to go to my website, which is shmartin, shmartin.com. And most of it you'll see is devoted to my marketing communications practice. I'm a consultant. But if you look up at the top, the menu, there's one of the little buttons you can click that says fiction and nonfiction. Click on that, and it'll go to a page that shows all my popular books, of which there's something like 36. And so you'll be able to look at the covers of those, and you can click on any one of those covers. It'll take you to the page on Amazon where you can read about the book. maybe read some reviews, probably click on the cover and read the first couple of chapters if you want. But I've got books on life after death, powerful evidence you'll never die. That's probably my bestseller right now. I've got other books on consciousness, the hard problem solved. I've got Your Guide to Fourth Density. So there are all kinds of books that might be interested, people might be interested in. If they're interested in this podcast, they certainly will be interested in those books. So it's shmartin, shmartin.com. Click on fiction, nonfiction button at the top in the menu, take you right to that page. Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure having you.